Welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we descend into the molten heart of Kilauea, where Pele, goddess of fire and creation, rules her volcanic throne with both fury and grace. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you have not already. Let your body settle into the place where you are resting now. Feel the weight of the day releasing slowly from your shoulders, your hands, the space behind your eyes. Tonight, we travel to an island born from fire. To a place where the ocean meets the sky at the edge of the world, and where the earth itself is alive, breathing, moving, dreaming in slow rivers of molten light. There is a goddess waiting for us there. She has been waiting a very long time. Part 1: The Island That Fire Built. There is a question that the ancient Hawaiians asked, long before the first temple stone was laid, long before the first fisherman cast his net into the blue-black waters off the Kona coast. The question was this: where does fire come from? Not the small fire of a torch. Not the polite fire of a cooking pit. But the fire that rises from the deep earth. The fire that moves like a slow river in the darkness. The fire that builds mountains from nothing. That swallows forests and extends the land itself inch by inch into the waiting sea. Where does that fire come from? The answer, to the people who first arrived on those shores, was not a mystery to be solved. It was a presence to be felt. A goddess to be known. Her name was Pele. And she did not merely live inside the volcano. She was the volcano. She was the lava and the steam and the sulphurous breath of the mountain. She was the red glow above the caldera on a dark night, and the slow black cooling of the hardened stone at the edge of the sea. To understand Pele, we must first understand the world she was born into. And that world begins not on the islands themselves, but far away, across a distance of water so vast that it would have seemed, to the people who crossed it, like crossing the edge of the known universe. The Hawaiian Islands were settled by Polynesian voyagers, perhaps as early as 300 CE, in the first great wave of migration, and again in larger numbers somewhere between 800 and 1200 CE in a second wave that would establish the culture and traditions we recognize today. These were extraordinary people. They navigated the open Pacific Ocean in double-hulled canoes using only the stars, the currents, the behavior of birds, and the feel of the swells beneath the hull of their vessels. They crossed thousands of miles of open water with no instruments, no maps as we would understand them, only an inherited knowledge of the ocean so deep and so precise that modern navigators still study it with wonder. When they arrived, what they found was a chain of islands unlike anywhere else they had ever been. The Hawaiian Islands are the most isolated archipelago on Earth. They sit in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 2,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass, which is North America to the northeast. They were formed entirely by volcanic activity, by a geological hotspot deep beneath the ocean floor that has been pushing magma upward through the crust of the Earth for tens of millions of years. As the Pacific Plate moves slowly northwest over this hotspot, new volcanoes form, and old ones are carried away and slowly erode into the sea. The Big Island of Hawaii, the largest and youngest island in the chain, is still directly over the hotspot. And it is still growing. The volcano Kilauea, on the southeastern slopes of the island, is one of the most continuously active volcanoes in the world. It has been erupting, in some form, for decades without stopping. The land it creates is new land. Black, raw, steaming land reaching into the sea. When the first Polynesian settlers arrived and saw this volcano, saw the rivers of glowing rock moving through the dark landscape, heard the deep rumble from within the mountain, smelled the sulfur on the wind, they did not reach for a scientific explanation. They reached for a story. And the story they told was Pele. In the cosmology of ancient Hawaii, the universe was not created in a single instant. It was sung into being. The great creation chant, the Kumalipo, describes a world that unfolds gradually from darkness into light, from the sea into the land, from the simplest organisms into the complex world of gods and humans. Everything that exists has its origin in this great unfolding. And Pele was part of that unfolding, a goddess who carried within herself the creative and destructive power of the molten earth. She was not a gentle goddess. She was not a goddess of comfort or of easy blessing. She was a goddess of transformation. Of the raw, unstoppable force that destroys in order to create. Of the lava that burns the forest but also builds the new land. Of the eruption that terrifies and devastates and, in the same breath, renews. The ancient Hawaiians understood this duality deeply. They did not see destruction and creation as opposites. They saw them as partners. The same force that burns is the same force that builds. And Pele embodied that truth more completely than any other being in their cosmological world. Her family, her travels, her loves and her rages, all of these were understood as reflections of the volcanic landscape itself. When the lava moved slowly and steadily down the mountain, that was Pele in a contemplative mood, building and extending. When the eruption was sudden and violent, when lava bombs flew through the sky and the mountain cracked and steam blasted from the summit, that was Pele in fury. When the caldera was quiet and only a thin plume of steam rose from the depths, that was Pele resting, dreaming, gathering her power. The landscape was not a backdrop to the story. The landscape was the story. And Pele was the one who told it, in rivers of fire and columns of smoke and the slow, patient building of a mountain from the floor of the sea. Before we meet her as a character, before we follow her on her journey from the far islands of her birth to the summit of Kilauea, it helps to understand the pantheon she belonged to. The gods and goddesses of ancient Hawaii were called Akua. They were powerful, present, and deeply woven into every aspect of life. The ocean, the forest, the rain, the wind, the taro plant, the shark, all of these had divine dimensions. All of these were presences to be honored and understood. Among the great Akua, there were several whose stories intersected again and again with Pele's. Her brother Kmoholii, the shark god, who guided her canoe across the Pacific. Her sister Hayaka, the goddess of healing and hula, who would become her closest companion and the center of the greatest story ever told about her. The god Cain, associated with fresh water and sunlight. The god Ku, associated with strength and war. The goddess Haumea, one of the great ancestral mothers. And then there were the others who would become entangled in Pele's story, the chiefs who fell in love with her, the demigods who challenged her, the enemies who tried to extinguish her fire and failed, always failed, because fire cannot truly be extinguished when it rises from the heart of the earth. But all of that comes later. For now, let us simply sit with the beginning. With the image of a volcanic island rising from the sea. Black rock still steaming. the smell of creation in the air. The first birds landing on the new ground, confused and curious. The first rain falling on the hot stone, hissing into steam. And somewhere in that steam, in that heat, in that slow-breathing mountain, a presence. Ancient and powerful and watching. Pele was there before the first human foot touched that shore. She would be there long after the last human departed. She is part of the island in a way that goes deeper than story, deeper than belief. She is part of the rock itself. Part 2, The Birth of a Goddess. Every divine being has an origin. And in the ancient Hawaiian tradition, knowing someone's origin, their genealogy, their ancestry, was not merely interesting. It was essential. The genealogy of a god or a chief was a form of power. A recitation of lineage was a declaration of identity, of connection, of place in the cosmic order. So when we ask who Pele is, we must first ask, where did she come from? Who were her parents? Who were her siblings? What world did she enter when she first opened her eyes? The traditions vary, as all living mythologies do. Stories passed through generations of oral telling naturally develop regional variations, emphasis shifts, names change slightly from island to island and from family to family. But there is a core that appears again and again in the accounts that were preserved, both in oral tradition and in the writings of those who recorded Hawaiian traditions in the 19th century. Pele, in the most widely told accounts, was born in a far land called Kahiki. This word, Kahiki, is the Hawaiian form of Tahiti, but its mythological meaning extends far beyond the geographical island. In the sacred traditions of ancient Hawaii, Kahiki was the ancestral homeland, the source place, the mythological point of origin from which the Hawaiian world descended. It was at once a real place somewhere to the south across the water, and a spiritual realm that existed at the boundary between the human world and the divine. Pele's father, in many versions of her story, was the god Kane Milohai, a form of the great god Kane associated with the earth and the sea floor. Her mother was Haumea, one of the most ancient and powerful of the Hawaiian goddesses, a great earth mother, a figure of immense age and transformative power, who appears throughout Hawaiian mythology in many forms, sometimes as a young woman, sometimes as an old one, always carrying the deep fertility and generational power of the earth itself. Into this lineage, Pele was born as one of many children. The family of Pele is large and complex, and each sibling carries a different aspect of the natural world. Moholii, the eldest brother, is the king of the sharks, lord of the deep ocean currents and the navigation of the open sea. He is among the most respected of the older siblings, and his relationship with Pele is one of deep protection and loyalty. When she travels, he often takes the form of a shark swimming at the bow of her canoe, guiding her safely. There are other brothers, gods of storms and seas and underwater caves. There are sisters, too. One of the most important is Mako Kai, the goddess of the ocean and of water. Her relationship with Pele is one of the great mythological tensions in the Hawaiian tradition, a rivalry between fire and water, between the volcano and the sea, that plays out in cosmic and deeply personal terms. We will return to Mako Kai. Her role in Pele's story is profound. And then there is Hayaka, little Hayaka, the youngest sister, born in the most unusual way of all. In one of the most tender and mysterious passages of Pele's mythology, it is said that Hayaka was conceived and born as an egg. And Pele, in her travels, carried that egg carefully, safely, close to her body, against her heart, keeping it warm through the long journey across the ocean, until the day when the egg opened and Hayaka emerged, small, luminous, smelling of flowers, everything soft and healing and green that Pele herself was not. A perfect opposite. A perfect complement. The relationship between Pele and Hayaka is one of the most beautiful and complex relationships in all of Hawaiian mythology. It is a love story, in the truest and deepest sense of that word, not romantic love, but the love of sisters, of opposites who belong together, of the volcano and the rain forest that grows on its slopes. Pele creates the raw land. Hayaka covers it in living green. Together, they make the island whole. But before any of that could happen, Pele had to leave Kahiki. And the reason she left is one of those mythological truths that speaks to something very deep in human experience, the tension between siblings, the hunger for one's own domain, the necessity of the journey. In many versions of the story, Pele left Kahiki because of conflict with her sister Mako Kai. The nature of this conflict varies in the telling. In some versions, Pele had taken, or been blamed for seducing, Mako Kai's husband. In other versions, the conflict was simply the ancient elemental tension between fire and water, inevitable and impersonal. Two forces that cannot coexist in the same space must separate and find their own kingdoms. But there are also accounts in which Pele herself felt the calling. She had heard of islands far to the north. Islands that sat over the great fire beneath the ocean floor. She felt them, perhaps, the way that fire feels toward the open air, a yearning to rise, to break through, to exist in all its fullness without being drowned or suppressed. And so she gathered her family. Her brothers and sisters who wished to come. She gathered supplies. She took the egg of little Hayaka and held it against her body. And she stepped into the canoe that her brother Kmoholii had readied, and she set out across the ocean toward the islands of fire that were calling her name. The crossing would have been enormous, thousands of miles across open ocean. In the mythology, this crossing is not simply a physical journey. It is a spiritual transit. A passage from one world to another. From the ancestral homeland to the new domain. From the place of origin to the place of becoming. And during that crossing, Mako Kai followed. The sea goddess, furious and powerful, sent storms and waves to capsize Pele's canoe, to drown her fire, to reclaim what she felt had been taken from her. This is the first of many contests between fire and water that would define Pele's mythology. The ocean trying to extinguish the fire. The fire refusing to be extinguished. The great shark Kmoholii swam at the bow of the canoe and navigated through the storms. Pele held on. She endured. She crossed. And when at last the canoe touched the northwestern edge of the Hawaiian island chain, at the low, ancient islands near what is now called Nihoa and Necker, the oldest of the chain, Pele stepped ashore and she began her search for a home. She carried with her a special tool, the sacred digging stick called paua. With this instrument she could probe the earth, seeking the deep fire beneath the surface. She would dig into the mountain and feel for the presence of lava below. And what she found, island by island, was that the fire was there, but not deep enough, not strong enough. Each time she found it, the ocean would follow, Mako Kai sending waves to flood her pit fires, to cool what had been ignited, to chase her further down the chain. This mythological movement down the Hawaiian island chain from northwest to southeast mirrors the actual geological progression of the islands, the oldest, most eroded islands in the northwest, the youngest and most volcanically active in the southeast. The myth and the earth tell the same story. Pele moved from the old islands to the new ones. She moved from the places where the fire had died down to the place where it still burned, still built, still reached upward through the seafloor with unstoppable force. She passed Kauai. She passed Oahu. She passed Molokai. She passed Maui, and here she stayed for a time on the great volcano of Haleakala, but even there the fire was not deep enough, the ocean too close. Until at last she came to the Big Island. To Kilauea. And there, when she drove the sacred paua into the earth and felt the fire answer back, felt the deep volcanic heat rising to meet her instrument, felt the earth recognize her touch, she knew she had found her home. She dug. The lava rose. The caldera opened. Steam and light filled the sky. Pele had found her kingdom. Part 3: The Caldera at the Heart of the World. Have you ever stood at the edge of something that could not be fully comprehended? A view so vast it exceeded the capacity of the eyes to contain it. An ocean that seemed to extend beyond the concept of distance. A night sky so full of stars that the darkness between them became more presence than absence. The ancient Hawaiians who approached the summit of Kilauea would have felt something like that. Something beyond comprehension. The caldera, that enormous bowl-shaped depression at the summit of the volcano, was not merely a geological feature to them. It was a doorway. A threshold between the surface world and the world beneath. The place where Pele lived. The place where the hidden fire of the earth met the air and the sky. Kilauea's summit caldera today is roughly 3 miles wide and 500 feet deep in places. But it has not always been this shape. It has expanded and contracted, deepened and filled, over centuries of eruption and collapse. There have been times in the historical record when the caldera held an active lava lake, a churning surface of molten rock glowing with an orange-red light visible from miles away. There have been other times when it was quiet. When steam was all that rose, and the lava had retreated to the deeper chambers of the mountain. To the ancient Hawaiians, these changes in the caldera's activity were not geological events. They were movements of the goddess herself. When the lava lake was high and turbulent, Pele was active, powerful, close to the surface of the world. When it was quiet, she was resting, or deep in thought, or traveling in human form through the villages and forests of the island. The Hawaiian name for the caldera at Kilauea's summit is Halemaumau, the House of Ferns. This name is both literal and mystical. In the cycles of volcanic activity, when a period of eruption ends and the land cools, ferns are among the first plants to grow back. They emerge from the cracks in the cooled lava, delicate and green, finding moisture in the smallest crevice. They are signs of life returning after fire. Signs of Hyaka's gentle presence following in Pele's wake. And so the caldera, the most sacred and powerful center of Pele's domain, carries the name of those returning ferns. The House of Renewal. The house of what comes back after the fire has passed. Within Halemaumau, according to the ancient traditions, Pele made her home. Not a house as humans would understand it, not walls and a roof and a floor. But the deeper architecture of the earth itself. Chambers of molten rock. Tunnels of fire. The great underground systems of lava tubes that carry the volcanic heat from the deep magma chambers to the surface and the sea. The Hawaiians knew about lava tubes. They walked through them, used them as shelters, observed them forming as fresh lava cooled on the outside while hot lava continued flowing inside, leaving hollow tunnels in the landscape. These tubes, to them, were the pathways of Pele, the corridors of her underground palace. To walk into a lava tube was to enter, cautiously and respectfully, the dwelling of the goddess. There were and are strict protocols, what the Hawaiians called kapu, around the volcanic landscape. Kapu was the sacred system of rules and prohibitions that governed Hawaiian society. Some things were forbidden. Some places could only be approached in the right way, with the right prayers, at the right time. The volcanic landscape was deeply kapu in many of its aspects. Certain areas of the caldera could not be entered without ritual preparation. Certain plants that grew near the volcano were sacred to Pele and could not be cut or taken. The Hialihua tree, whose bright red blossoms appear among the first flowers to grow on new lava flows, was especially sacred, associated with both Pele and with the regeneration of the forest. There is a beautiful story associated with the Hialihua tree. It is said that once there was a young man named Haya who loved a woman named Lihua. Their love was great and their bond was deep. But Pele, in one of her journeys through the island in human form, saw Haya and desired him. He refused her, for he loved Lihua and no other. And Pele, who was not always a goddess of patient or gentle temperament, transformed him in her anger. She turned him into a tree. The gnarled, twisted, silver-barked tree that grows in the volcanic landscape. And Lihua, heartbroken, wept. The other gods, moved by her grief, transformed her as well, into the bright red flower that blooms on that same tree. And so the two lovers remained together. Haya and Lihua. The tree and its flower. Forever united in the volcanic forest, the first green returning to the black lava fields. It is said that if you pick the Lihua flower from the Haya tree without proper acknowledgement, it will rain. That the rain is Lihua's tears, her grief at being separated, even for a moment, from her beloved. Whether you believe this as mythology or as memory or as something else entirely, there is something in the image that carries a truth about love and transformation and the way grief and beauty are woven together. But let us return to the caldera. To Pele and her home. The descriptions of Pele's dwelling in the Hawaiian tradition are remarkably consistent. She lives in the deepest chamber of the volcano, in a palace of fire. Around her are her family, her brothers and sisters who chose to come with her from Kahiki. Her brothers, the fire gods, tend the furnaces of the earth. Her sisters move through the volcanic landscape in their own forms, Hayaka walking the rain forests above the caldera, caring for the land, healing the sick, singing her sacred chants. She was not a distant god. She was not a god who sat in a heaven above the clouds and looked down on humanity from an unreachable altitude. She was immediate. She was present. She was just below the surface of the ground. A living force that could be felt in the warmth of the earth, smelled in the sulfur on the wind, seen in the glow above the mountain at night. This proximity gave her a different quality in the imagination of her people than many divine figures carry in their traditions. She was not to be prayed to from a distance. She was to be spoken with. Approached with respect, yes. Approached with care and with the proper rituals, yes. but approached. The priests and priestesses of Pele, the kahuna, the specialists in her specific tradition, maintained an ongoing relationship with the goddess. They tended her fires. They offered gifts at the caldera edge. They watched for signs in the behavior of the lava, read the patterns of the eruption, interpreted her moods and her intentions. The tradition of offering to Pele is deep and ancient. Offerings were cast into the caldera: flowers, food, strands of hair, precious objects. The practice continues today, in various forms, among native Hawaiians who maintain their ancestral spiritual traditions. And there is a famous account, repeated in many sources, of the 19th century Hawaiian chiefess Kapiolani, who was among the first converts to Christianity on the Big Island, descending to the edge of the caldera at Kilauea and publicly defying the old prohibitions, eating the sacred hilo berries that were traditionally offered to Pele before consumption, casting stones into the caldera, and proclaiming that it was her Christian god and not Pele who held power. That account, while recorded by missionaries with their own perspective on its meaning, tells us something about how immediate and how serious the question of Pele's power was to the people of that time. You do not publicly challenge something that you do not genuinely believe in. The defiance was real because the belief was real. For most of Hawaiian history, though, Pele was not defied. She was honored. She was listened to. She was loved, in the complex way that powerful and unpredictable things can be loved, with a love that contains as much awe and caution as it does warmth. The love of people for a force that can destroy them and also sustain them. The love of people for the earth itself. Part 4: Fire and Water, the Eternal Rivalry. There is a truth about the Hawaiian Islands that the ancient people understood in mythological terms before science arrived to confirm it. The islands are the product of a contest between fire and water. Between the volcanic force pushing upward from below and the ocean pressing inward from every side. The lava reaches the shore and falls into the sea, hissing and steaming, and the new land solidifies and extends. And then the waves come, patient, relentless, and they carve and erode. They carve cliffs and sea arches and tide pools from the new rock. The fire builds and the water shapes. Both forces are essential to what the islands become. In the mythology of Pele, this geological reality is given faces and names and stories. The fire is Pele. And the water, in its oceanic, overwhelming, swallowing form, is Mako Kai. Mako Kai is a fascinating and often misunderstood figure in the Hawaiian tradition. She tends to appear in the stories primarily in her role as Pele's antagonist, the elder sister who chases the younger, the water that tries to drown the fire. But she is not simply a villain in the story. She is a goddess of immense power in her own right. She is the ocean in all its depth and mystery. She rules the waves and the currents. She is the force that surrounds the islands, that connects them to the rest of the world, and that can, in an instant, swallow what the volcano has made. The conflict between Pele and Mako Kai begins, as we touched on in the last section, before the journey to Hawaii. It begins in Kahiki, in the ancestral homeland, with some form of transgression, real or perceived. The specific nature of the transgression varies in different versions of the story. In some, Pele was associated with Mako Kai's husband. In others, the conflict is less personal and more elemental, a recognition that fire and water cannot share the same space, that one will always try to defeat the other, and that this contest is written into the nature of things. Whatever its origin, the conflict followed Pele across the ocean. Mako Kai sent her forces, storms, waves, the deep swells of the open Pacific, to capsize the canoe, to drown Pele before she could reach her destination. And when Pele arrived at the northwestern islands of the Hawaiian chain and began to establish her fire, Mako Kai followed. The sea flooded in. The fire was extinguished. Pele moved on. This happened again and again. On Kauai, Pele dug a fire pit, the place that became the crater of Pukeoi according to some traditions, and the ocean came and put it out. On Oahu she tried again, and on Molokai, and on Maui. Each time, Mako Kai found her and brought the ocean's power to bear. There is a remarkable moment in some versions of this myth in which the confrontation becomes direct and physical. Not the ocean flooding a fire pit, but the two goddesses themselves meeting in battle. This encounter takes place on the island of Maui, in the district of Kahakuloa. Mako Kai and Pele fight directly, a battle between elemental forces that reshapes the landscape of the island. In these accounts, Pele is defeated. Her body is broken. Her bones are scattered across the hillside, and the place where they fell is marked in the landscape. But here is the thing about Pele. She cannot truly be killed. She is the fire inside the earth, and the fire inside the earth does not die. Her spirit, her divine essence, the true form of her power, retreated from the broken body on Maui and made its way to the Big Island. To Kilauea. To the place where the fire was deep enough, strong enough, constant enough that even Mako Kai could not reach it. The lava tubes and underground chambers of Kilauea go deep. Far deeper than the ocean can reach. In the most profound pits of the volcano, the fire is beyond the reach of water. And there Pele made her final home. There she could not be followed. There she could not be drowned. This mythological pattern, the defeat, the apparent death, the retreat to the deeper fire, the survival, is one of the most powerful and recurring patterns in Pele's mythology. It reflects something true about fire itself. You can pour water on a fire and it seems to go out. But if the heat source is deep enough and strong enough, the fire returns. It breaks through in a new place. It finds the surface again. The Earth's volcanic fire has been pouring water on itself and returning for millions of years. The tension between Pele and Mako Kai does not end with Pele's establishment on the Big Island. It continues, in a different form, in the ongoing contest between the volcanic coastline and the sea. Every time lava enters the ocean at the Kalapana coast or the Puna coast, fire and water are meeting again. Steam billows. The water hisses and cools the lava instantly into the strange glass-like structures called limu o Pele, Pele's seaweed, thin, translucent sheets of volcanic glass formed when lava rapidly cools in water. And slowly, the new land forms, and the fire wins, for a time, another few yards at the edge of the sea. And when the storms come in from the northwest, and the waves crash against the new coastline, the water takes back what it can. The contest continues. It has been continuing for millions of years and will continue for millions more. Among those who maintain the traditional Hawaiian spiritual practices today, Mako Kai is regarded not as an enemy but as a necessary force. Her role in the cosmic order is as important as Pele's. Without the ocean's carving and shaping, the islands would be nothing but raw piles of volcanic rock. It is the interplay of fire and water together that makes the islands what they are: beautiful, fertile, complex, alive. The rivalry, in the deepest sense, is a partnership. The sisters who fight each other are also sisters who together make the world. And in the quiet between eruptions, when the caldera is still and the ocean is calm and the sun is setting over the Pacific with its long gold light, perhaps, in that stillness, even Pele and Mako Kai are at rest. At peace. Sisters again, if only until the next movement of the earth. Part 5, Pele in human form, the goddess who walks among the people. She does not always announce herself. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Pele's relationship with the human world. She is a goddess of great power, yes. She rules the volcano. She shapes the landscape. She can destroy a village with a river of lava and build a new island from the floor of the sea. All of that is true. But she also walks the roads. She sits by the fire at the edge of a village. She appears at the door of a home as a stranger asking for shelter. She travels in disguise, in human form, through the world of ordinary people. And the encounters she has in those human forms are among the most important and most instructive stories in the entire body of Pele's mythology. In the Hawaiian tradition, the ability of gods to appear in human form, to take on a mortal disguise and move through the world incognito, was called Akua no Ho'ili, the god who inhabits the body. It was a reminder that the divine was not absent from the human world, not locked away in some inaccessible heaven, but present and moving and sometimes standing right beside you, unknown. Pele in human form is described most often in two ways. In one form, she appears as a beautiful young woman, lovely and luminous, with bright eyes that carry a heat in them, a glow. In this form, she is radiant and magnetic. Men and women both are drawn to her. She carries herself with an unmistakable quality that people feel even when they do not understand what they are feeling. A warmth. A presence. Something that says this is not an ordinary person. In another form, she appears as an old woman, white-haired, wrinkled, perhaps lame, perhaps ragged. She walks slowly. She appears to need help. She asks for food, for water, for shelter. She seems powerless, unimportant, easily dismissed. And in this form, she tests. She learns the character of the people she encounters. The generous are rewarded. The cruel or the dismissive are not. There are many stories of this pattern. A chief who welcomed the old woman wanderer and shared his meal received, in the morning, the revelation of who she truly was, and with it, a blessing on his household and his lineage. A household that turned the old woman away and mocked her found, in the night, the sound of the earth moving, and in the morning looked up to see a river of lava moving slowly down the mountain toward their village. These stories are deeply instructive within the Hawaiian ethical framework. They carry the message that hospitality is sacred. That how you treat a stranger, any stranger, even a ragged old woman begging at your door, reflects your character and your relationship with the divine. Because the divine walks in disguise. The divine is in the stranger. Turn away the stranger, and you have turned away the goddess. There is another category of Pele's human form appearances that moves in a different direction, her encounters with chiefs and warriors who fall in love with her without knowing who she is. These stories are among the most dramatic in the entire Hawaiian tradition, and they tell us something important about Pele's nature, that her passion and her anger are two sides of the same force. The same intensity that makes her a lover makes her terrifying when she is betrayed. One of the most well-known of these stories involves a chief named Lohio, who lived on the island of Kauai. He was handsome, skilled in the hula, beloved by his people. And he became the center of one of the most sweeping and complex stories ever told in Hawaiian mythology, a story that would involve not only Pele herself but her beloved sister Hiaka, and a journey across all the islands of the chain. We will reach that story soon. But before we do, let us linger a little longer with the image of Pele walking among the people. Consider what it would mean to live in a world where you genuinely believed that any stranger might be the goddess. Not as a metaphor, not as an idea you held abstractly, but as a lived reality you felt in your body. Where you looked at the white-haired woman walking slowly along the edge of the road and thought, "Is that her?" Where you smelled the faint sulfur on a warm wind and understood it as her breath? Where the red glow above the mountain at night was not a geological phenomenon to be monitored and evacuated from, but the hearth fire of a being you knew, whose moods and motivations you spent your whole life learning to read. The mythological consciousness of the ancient Hawaiians was not a separate compartment of life, a religious belief held in one category while daily practical life proceeded in another. It was woven into everything. The naming of places, the observance of kapu, the reading of natural signs, the structure of social relationships, all of it existed within a framework of meaning that included the divine as a constant, present, active force. And Pele was perhaps the most constant and present of all the Akua, because her home was visible. You could see the glow of her house at night. You could smell the sulfur she breathed. You could feel the warmth of the earth she lived in when you walked on certain parts of the mountain. She was not abstract. She was not distant. She was the landscape you lived in, and she might, at any moment, be the person you met on the road. This created a quality of attention in the people who lived in her shadow, an attentiveness to the world, to other people, to signs and omens, to the way things felt. A quality of presence that we might, in our own time and place, recognize as a form of profound spiritual awareness. Not the attentiveness of fear, though fear had its place. The attentiveness of love. Of relationship. Of knowing that the world is alive around you and that attention is the form of respect you pay to a living world. And in those moments when the earth trembled and the old woman who had been sitting at the fire was gone and no one had seen her leave, in those moments, the people would look up at the mountain and know, with absolute certainty, that she had come among them, and walked with them, and gone back to her deep house in the fire. Part 6, The Love of Pele and the Chief of Kauai. What does it feel like when a goddess dreams of you? According to the ancient Hawaiian tradition, this is not merely a poetic question. It is a literal one. Because there came a time when Pele, deep in her volcanic palace at Halamamo, lay in the state that is called wana, the deep trance of a sleeping or dreaming god, and in that trance she traveled. Her spirit rose from her body like smoke rising from the caldera, and it moved northward over the ocean, past the Big Island's coast, past Maui, past the waters between the islands, until it arrived on the island of Kauai. Kauai, the Garden Island, as it is now called, is the oldest of the main Hawaiian islands. Its volcanic peaks are rounded and deeply eroded by millions of years of rain. Waterfalls cascade down its green cliffs. Its valleys are lush beyond description. It is an island that has had time, and the gentleness that comes with time. The fire that built it has long since cooled. And on this island, in a village by the sea, a chief named Lohio was playing the drum. In the Hawaiian tradition, the hula is not merely a dance. It is a sacred practice, a form of prayer, a way of honoring the gods and the natural world. The chants that accompany the hula carry cosmological knowledge, histories of the gods, genealogies of the chiefs, descriptions of the natural world and its sacred dimensions. The drum, the pahu, is the heartbeat of this practice. And Lohio was a master of the drum, a beloved chief, a man whose grace and beauty were spoken of across the islands. In her dream form, Pele arrived at his gathering and she watched him. She heard the drum and felt its rhythm, and she was captivated. The story says that she was drawn to him not merely by physical beauty but by the quality of his soul, his grace, his skill, his joy in the music. In some versions of the story, she took human form even in the dream, and she joined his gathering and danced with him, and he felt the unusual warmth of her presence without understanding it. When Pele returned to her body in the caldera, she was changed. She had fallen in love. And a goddess who has fallen in love is a force of nature in a new configuration. She called for her beloved sister Hayaka. Hayaka, who lived in the rainforest above the caldera, who tended the ferns and the flowers, who healed the sick with her prayers and her gentle hands. The most beloved of all Pele's sisters. The one she trusted most completely. Pele told Hayaka what had happened. She told her about Lohio, about the drum, about the dream. And she asked, she commanded, with the authority of an older sister and a goddess, she asked Hayaka to make the journey to Kauai. To travel all the way to the far island at the north of the chain. To find Lohio and to bring him back to Pele on the Big Island. This was an enormous ask. The distance from the Big Island to Kauai is considerable even by modern standards. In the ancient world, it meant a sea voyage of several days, followed by a land journey across Kauai to find the chief. And then another sea voyage back, accompanied by a chief who might or might not be willing to come. Hayaka agreed. She was devoted to her sister. But she had conditions, requests, more properly, for she was a goddess in her own right and her power was real. She asked that while she was away, Pele would protect her beloved Hialeahua forests on the slopes of Kilauea. The forest she had tended and loved. The green world she had made from the new lava. She asked that Pele would not let the lava flow into those forests while she was gone. And she asked that 40 days be the time limit, 40 days to travel to Kauai, find Lohio, and return. Pele agreed to both conditions. And so Hayaka set out. She was accompanied by her own companion and friend, a mortal woman named Wahine Mau, who would travel with her on the journey, one of those beloved mortal companions that appear in mythologies everywhere, the human alongside the divine. The journey of Hayaka across the Hawaiian Islands is itself an epic, a mythological narrative of tremendous scope and beauty that forms the core of the great poetic tradition surrounding Pele's story. As Hayaka traveled, she encountered monsters, she healed the sick, she fought supernatural enemies, she wove magic with her prayers and her sacred chants. She moved through the landscape like rain moves, cleaning, renewing, bringing life where she passed. But as she traveled, the 40 days stretched. She encountered more obstacles than had been anticipated. She stopped to heal a chief dying of supernatural illness. She fought a giant Moo, the Hawaiian dragon or supernatural lizard, who had blocked the path and drowned travelers in a haunted pool. She navigated treacherous seas and found her way through places that held dangerous spiritual energies. And all the while, on the Big Island, Pele waited. And waiting was not something that came naturally to a goddess of fire. The 40 days passed. Hayaka had not returned. Pele's love had become something else, that volatile and painful shift that happens when longing is stretched too long. It had become suspicion. Had Hayaka perhaps kept Lohio for herself? Was her beloved sister, her most trusted companion, betraying her? She looked toward the north in her mind. And in the way of gods who can see across great distances when they choose, she found them, Hayaka and Lohio, together on the cliff at Haina on Kauai. They were close together. Too close, in Pele's reading of the vision. What she saw was ambiguous. In some tellings, there was nothing improper occurring. Hayaka was simply comforting a chief who was, by that point, shattered by events we will address shortly. In other tellings, Hayaka, heartbroken herself by what she had found on her return to the Big Island, had allowed the closeness between herself and Lohio to become something more than a sister's mission. But Pele did not wait for clarity. She was fire, and fire does not always wait. She sent the lava into the forest she had promised to protect, into the beloved green world of Hayaka that stretched across the slopes above the caldera. She let it flow, a deliberate, purposeful release of the volcanic fire, directed at the thing her sister loved most. The forests burned. The ferns died. The haya trees that Hayaka had tended for generations were swallowed in the slow red river of the lava. And Hayaka, approaching the Big Island on her return journey, would have smelled the smoke. Would have seen the black cloud rising from where her forest had been. Would have understood in that moment exactly what had happened and why. What follows is one of the most heartbreaking passages in all of Hawaiian mythology. But before we arrive there, we must understand what happened to Lohio, because his story, too, is one of transformation, of loss, and ultimately of something like grace. Part 7: The Death and Resurrection of Lohio. In the time between Pele's dream journey to Kauai and Hayaka's arrival there, something terrible had happened. Lohio had died. After the dream, after the extraordinary encounter with the warm and luminous stranger who had arrived at his gathering and danced with him, after she had vanished as unexpectedly as she came, Lohio had been left with a feeling he could not name or resolve. Something had visited him. Something immense and strange and beautiful. And it was gone. He pined. In the Hawaiian tradition, there is a concept of this, of heartache becoming physical, of grief for a lost beloved becoming an illness of the body as well as the spirit. Lohio stopped eating. He stopped drumming. He sat by the shore and looked out at the ocean and asked it for something he could not quite articulate. And eventually he died of it. Of grief. Of longing. Of the particular desolation of having been touched by something divine and then left. When Hayaka arrived on Kauai after her long journey across the islands, this is what she found. Not the living chief she had been sent to bring back, but the news of his death, the mourning of his people, the wrapped body resting in the place where it had been laid. Anyone else might have turned back. might have returned to Pele with the news that the mission had failed, that Lohio was dead, that there was nothing to be done. But Hayaka was not anyone else. She was a goddess of healing and of life. She was the one who made the green world return after the fire passed through. She was the one who brought the ferns back to the cooled lava. She was the one who could, if her prayers were deep enough and her power sufficient, call a spirit back from the place where the dead go. And so she tried. The process of bringing Lohio back involved the use of Hayaka's most sacred prayers, the Ali, the chants that called upon the divine powers she carried. She moved to the place where his body lay and she began to sing. She sang his name. She sang the names of the gods who held the doorway between the world of the living and the world of the dead. She sang the landscape that Lohio had known, the cliffs of Kauai, the sound of the waves at Haina, the drum, the hula gathering. She sang it back to him as an invitation, a reminder, a reason to return. The Hawaiian concept of the soul, the Uhane, held that at the moment of death, the spirit could take time to depart. It might hover near the body, might linger in the places it had known. If it had not traveled too far, if it had not fully crossed over into the darkness of the ancestral realm, it could be called back. A skilled healer, a kahuna pa of sufficient power, could retrieve the wandering soul and return it to the body. Hayaka had that power. She called Lohio's soul back. Through the night, through the long work of her sacred prayers, she persisted. And in the early light, in the shifting between darkness and dawn that is always the most liminal, the most permeable time, Lohio breathed again. There must have been a quality to that moment that defies easy description. The stillness of a body that has been dead. And then the first breath. The first movement of the chest. The eyes opening, confused and full of the memory of wherever they had been. The faces of the mourners changing from grief to something they had no name for. Lohio had died and been brought back. He was changed by it, as people are always changed by the edges of such experiences. There was a quality of preciousness to things now, to the sound of the ocean, to the green of the hills, to the feeling of sunlight on skin. He had been somewhere else and returned, and the world was different for the having been away. Hayaka told him why she had come. Who had sent her? That on the Big Island, the goddess Pele waited for him, and that he was invited to make the journey and become her companion. One does not easily decline an invitation from the goddess of the volcano. But Lohio was also, by this point, aware of Hayaka, of the extraordinary woman who had called him back from death, who had sung him into the world again. His heart was complicated now in ways that would matter deeply before the story reached its end. Together, Hayaka and Lohio and Wahine Mau gathered themselves for the return journey. They set out southward, island by island, toward the Big Island. And it was during this return journey that Hayaka arrived on the Big Island and found her forest gone. Found the black lava where the green had been. Found the evidence of Pele's jealousy and rage. And in her grief, in the grief of a goddess who had sacrificed everything, had traveled farther than any mortal could have traveled, had fought monsters and healed the dying and called the dead back to life, and returned to find her most precious possession destroyed as punishment for an accusation that was not yet proven true, in that grief, Hayaka made a choice. She embraced Lohio. In full sight of Halamamo. In full sight of the caldera where Pele watched. If she was to be punished for a betrayal, let there be one. She had already lost her forest. She had already lost her innocence in Pele's eyes. And Lohio was alive because of her. He was, in some sense, hers. What happened next was the eruption of Pele's fury. Part 8, The Rage of Fire, Pele's Wrath and its Aftermath. There is no halfway with fire. When wood catches fire, it does not catch a little and then stop and reconsider. When the volcano erupts, it does not erupt halfway. Fire is, by its nature, total. It gives itself completely or it gives nothing. And Pele's rage, in the traditions of ancient Hawaii, was understood in exactly this way. It was not the small anger of wounded pride. It was not the manageable frustration of a person whose feelings had been hurt. It was elemental. It was the same force that sent lava rolling down the mountainside, unstoppable and all-consuming. When Pele saw Hayaka embrace Lohio at the edge of the caldera, when the confirmation of what she had feared finally arrived before her eyes, she did what she always did when her most powerful feelings had no other direction to go. She sent the fire. The lava rose from Halemaumau. Not the slow, patient lava of a steady eruption building new land. The sudden, explosive fire of a summit eruption driven by fury. And it reached for Lohio. Lohio, who had already died once and been brought back, now faced the fire of the volcano goddess herself. He could not run from it. No human runs from a volcanic eruption without somewhere to go, and Pele controlled the mountain, controlled the path of the fire. The lava surrounded him and he burned, and his body was consumed, and his spirit was gone into the darkness again, this time further, this time into a different realm than the lingering place from which Hayaka had retrieved him before. And Hayaka watched. Let us sit with that for a moment. With the image of Hayaka standing at the edge of the destruction, watching the fire consume the man she had resurrected, the man she had traveled the whole length of the island chain to bring back, the man whose death by grief she had undone with the full power of her sacred prayers. Watching him burn for the second time. The grief of Hayaka in this moment is one of the most profound emotional passages in Hawaiian mythology. She who had the power to heal, to bring life, to call the dead back from their wandering, she who had done exactly that for Lohio, watched him destroyed by the very force that had sent her on the mission to save him. The injustice of it, if we read it through a human moral lens, is sharp and clear. Hayaka had done everything asked of her. She had sacrificed. She had endured. She had succeeded at something thought impossible. And in return, her forest was burned and her rescued charge was taken from her. But the mythology does not ask us to simply condemn Pele. And this is important. Because in the Hawaiian tradition, Pele's rage, destructive, unjust, consuming, is not presented as a moral failing to be corrected but as a force of nature to be understood. The volcano does not burn forests because it is evil. It burns forests because it is the volcano. The forest that is burned will, in time, regrow from the very land that the lava makes. Destruction and creation are not opposites. They are the same cycle. And Pele herself, in many versions of the story, does not remain in a state of righteous anger. The fire of rage, like all fire, eventually burns down to something else. What remains can be sadness. Can be recognition of what was lost. can be the complicated terrain of a relationship between two sisters who love each other and have also hurt each other in ways that cannot be easily healed. There are versions of the story in which Pele, when her rage had cooled, acknowledged that what she had done to Hayaka's forest was a violation of her promise. That the punishment exceeded the transgression. That she had acted from jealousy rather than from truth. The reconciliation between Pele and Hayaka, in the traditions where it occurs, is slow and fragile and hard won, as true reconciliations always are. It is not a simple forgiveness. It is a negotiation between two beings who have hurt each other, who love each other, who are bound together by ties that go deeper than any quarrel, and who must find a way to continue existing in the same world. As for Lohio, he was not permanently lost. This, too, the mythology provides for. Because the god Cain Milohai, Pele's father, or in other accounts her brother Kmoholii, intervened. The spirit of Lohio was retrieved, by one of the other divine siblings, by a being with the power to navigate the realm of the dead, and Lohio was restored to life. He returned to Kauai. He returned to his drum and his people and the green cliffs above the sea. Some versions of the story say that eventually, after everything, Lohio became Hayaka's companion rather than Pele's. That the love that had grown between them, born in grief and resurrection and shared journey, was deeper and more enduring than the passion of a dream. And Pele, in these versions, does not oppose this. She has her mountain. She has her fire. She has her eternal place in the heart of the earth. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps, in the long view, the view of a goddess who has existed since before the island rose from the sea, the love of Lohio was always a temporary passion, a human attachment too brief and fragile to truly contain her. And Hayaka, who has always been the green life that returns after the fire, was always going to be the one who kept him. The one who brings things back is also the one who keeps them. And in the caldera, the fire continued. Deep and steady and patient. Undiminished by the drama of love and loss above it. Still building. Still creating. Still reaching for the surface. Part 9, Sisters of the Fire, Pele's Divine Family. Ask anyone who has grown up in a large family about the dynamics of sisters and brothers, and they will tell you, the complexity is the truth. The love is real. The conflict is real. The history between siblings is longer and more layered than most other relationships, because it begins at the very beginning, before identity is fully formed, before anyone has learned how to be who they are going to be. Pele's family, as described across the body of Hawaiian mythology, is large and multifaceted and alive with exactly that kind of complexity. We have met several of her siblings already, Kmoholii the shark god, Mako Kai the sea goddess, Hayaka the healing sister. But the family extends further. And each member carries within their mythology both their own distinct divine character and their relationship to Pele, their position in the constellation of fire, water, ocean, and sky that makes up the family of the volcano goddess. Among Pele's brothers are several who are closely associated with specific volcanic phenomena. There is Kaholii, who in some traditions is a god of the underworld, associated with the deep volcanic depths, moving between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. There is Lanamakwa, sometimes called the father of fire, associated with the keeping of fire itself, the preservation of the flame, the knowledge of how to start and maintain a fire, the technology, and spirit of fire that humans depend upon. In some traditions, it was Lanamakwa who gave fire to the people of Hawaii, teaching them its uses, for cooking, for warmth, for the preparation of kapa cloth, for the ceremonial fires of the heiau. Then there is the remarkable figure of Kapo. Kapo is one of Pele's sisters, a goddess of the hula in her own right, and also associated with sorcery and the darker arts of the kahuna. She is a complicated figure, sometimes protective and sometimes dangerous, connected to matters of fertility and to the spiritual power that can be used for harm as well as healing. In some traditions, Kapo and Hayaka represent opposite aspects of the same female divine energy, one dark, one light, one associated with sorcery, one with healing, one with the shadow beneath the earth, one with the green world above it. There are also the fire goddesses who are understood as forms of Pele herself, aspects or manifestations of the volcanic principle that she embodies. Pele is sometimes spoken of not as a single individual but as a class of being, a category of divine fire that can manifest in many forms, in different volcanoes, in different eruption types. The distinction between Pele as a specific goddess and Pele as the principle of volcanic fire is deliberately fluid in the tradition, because in Hawaiian thought, the boundary between a divine being and the natural phenomenon they embody is not a fixed line. This fluidity is part of what makes Hawaiian mythology so different from, say, the Greek or Norse mythologies that many people in the Western world are most familiar with. In those traditions, the gods are generally distinct from the forces of nature, they govern the storm, but the storm is not the god. In Hawaiian mythology, the god often is the natural phenomenon. Pele is not the goddess who controls the volcano. She is the volcanic fire itself, given a person, a name, a history, a family, a set of feelings and relationships. This means that the stories told about Pele are not merely entertaining tales about a supernatural being. They are descriptions of volcanic reality, encoded in the language of the personal and the relational. When the mythology says that Pele was angry, it is also saying something true about how eruptions behave, sudden, consuming, preceded by a building pressure that has no other release. When the mythology says that Pele was in love, it is saying something true about the way the volcanic fire reaches toward the surface, extends itself into the air, pursues an upward direction with a kind of yearning that has no equivalent elsewhere in the natural world. Hayaka's role in the family is worth pausing with further. She is, in many ways, the most beloved figure in the entire tradition surrounding Pele, loved by the people who told the stories, loved by scholars who have studied the tradition, loved because she represents something that the human heart recognizes and aches for. She is goodness that has been given form. Healing. Care. The patient work of tending the green world. The courage to travel alone through dangerous territory because someone you love asked you to. The loyalty that holds even when it is tested. There is a great body of chants associated with Hayaka, the Mololo o Hayakaikapoli appeal, the story of Hayaka in the bosom of Pele, that is considered one of the most significant literary works in the entire Hawaiian tradition. It was recorded in serialized form in Hawaiian language newspapers in the 19th century, where it ran for months, told in installments, read by a Hawaiian literate audience who received it as a continuation of a living tradition rather than an archival preservation. These chants and stories cover not only the mission to Kauai to retrieve Lohio but the entire journey, every encounter on every island, every healing, every battle with supernatural enemies, every chant that Hayaka sang as she moved through the landscape. The geography of the Hawaiian Islands is embedded in the story at every level. Every significant place has its spiritual character established through Hayaka's interaction with it. The story is, among other things, a sacred geography, a way of knowing the landscape through the eyes of someone who moved through it with full awareness of its divine dimensions. And at the center of it all, always, is the relationship between the two sisters. The fire and the green. The destroying force and the renewing force. The one who burns and the one who comes after. Pele and Hayaka, the two faces of the living island. In the deepest Hawaiian understanding of the natural world, this pair is not in conflict. They are in dialogue. Pele burns the forest. Hayaka brings it back. Pele creates new land. Hayaka covers it in life. The same island that is being destroyed is being renewed. The same lava that kills the forest feeds the new soil that will, in centuries, support a forest more lush than the one before. This is the long view. The geological view. The view of a being who has existed long enough to see forests grown and burned and grown again 100 times. And it is Pele's view, at her deepest and most settled. Not the view of the moment of rage, but the view of the deep volcano, patient, permanent, building from below with slow and inexhaustible power. Part 10, The People of the Fire, Honoring Pele Through History. Every goddess lives, in some sense, in the devotion of the people who honor her. The myths are one dimension of Pele's existence, the stories, the cosmological framework, the genealogy, the great narratives of travel and love and fury and reconciliation. But there is another dimension that is equally important, and that is the lived practice of her people. The way ordinary Hawaiian men and women and children related to her presence in their daily lives. The rituals, the offerings, the restrictions, the prayers, the reading of signs. And this is where the story of Pele becomes most beautifully human, because it is in the practices of ordinary people, in the small, daily acts of acknowledgement and respect, that a divine presence is kept alive and present in the world. The heiau were the great ceremonial structures of ancient Hawaii. These stone platforms and enclosures served as places of worship, of prayer, of the great ceremonies that structured the Hawaiian ritual year. Some heiau were dedicated to specific gods, to Ku, god of war, to Lono, god of agriculture and peace, to Kane and Kanaloa, the great paired gods of fresh water and the ocean deep. And some were dedicated to Pele. The heiau dedicated to Pele were not always elaborate stone structures. Sometimes the most sacred sites associated with her were natural, the rim of the caldera itself, certain lava formations that were understood as her physical manifestation, specific vents or fumaroles where steam and sulfurous gas rose from the earth. These natural sites were as sacred as any constructed temple, perhaps more so, because they were not built by human hands. They were places where Pele herself had expressed her presence. At such sites, offerings were made. The hilo berry, the small, red, tart berry of a plant native to the Hawaiian volcanic landscape, was one of the most significant offerings. The hilo is sacred to Pele, and in the traditional practice, before eating the berries, a portion was offered to her. A person would take a branch of hilo berries and, turning toward the caldera, would offer some to the east, some to the west, and say a prayer of acknowledgement, na Pele, for Pele, before consuming any themselves. This practice speaks to something fundamental in the relationship between Pele and her people. She was not a distant deity who demanded elaborate performances. She was a presence who asked for recognition. A simple acknowledgement that this fruit grows on your mountain, that we take from your land, that we offer back before we consume. It is the same principle that underlies many traditional ecological relationships, the understanding that what we take from the natural world is a gift, not an entitlement, and that the appropriate response to a gift is gratitude. There were also more elaborate ritual practices associated with Pele's volcanic activity. When an eruption began, when the lava started moving down the mountain, the response of the people in its path was not purely practical. It was also spiritual. Prayers were offered. The kahuna who specialized in Pele's tradition were consulted. In some cases, specific rituals were performed at the edge of the advancing lava, not to stop it, because stopping it was understood to be beyond human power and perhaps beyond the appropriate boundary of human action, but to ask Pele where she was going, to understand the eruption as an expression of her will, and to respond appropriately. There are accounts of specific individuals who were believed to have the ability to redirect lava flows through prayer, not by overpowering Pele but by speaking to her, by pleading a case, by offering something that could turn her attention in a different direction. These accounts are treated within the tradition as real events, as genuine interventions, as proof of the ongoing relationship between the spiritual specialists and the goddess. Whether we interpret these accounts through a spiritual or a psychological or a geological lens, what they tell us is consistent. The relationship between the people of Hawaii and Pele was active, reciprocal, and conducted in the language of relationship rather than the language of supplication to an indifferent force. The volcanic landscape was not experienced as something that happened to people but as someone who related to them. The chiefly system of ancient Hawaii, the Ali'i, the nobility, had its own particular relationship with Pele. The greatest chiefs traced their genealogies to the gods, including the volcanic deities. To claim descent from Pele was to claim a lineage of immense power, the power of the fire itself, the power that builds islands. This genealogical connection was not merely symbolic. It carried practical political weight, because in Hawaiian society, mana, spiritual power, was inherited, accumulated, and expressed through lineage. A chief who could trace their ancestry to Pele carried Pele's mana in their very blood. This is why the recitation of genealogy, the chanting of lineage from the beginning of the cosmos to the present person, was such a formal and serious practice. It was an assertion of identity, of power, of relationship to the divine. And it was a practice that required accuracy and mastery, because a false or garbled genealogy was not merely an embarrassment. It was a spiritual diminishment. The Moo, the supernatural lizard beings of Hawaiian tradition, are another element of Pele's mythological world worth understanding. The Moo are ancient supernatural beings, generally taking the form of giant lizards or dragons, associated with water, with rivers, ponds, and the darker, watery places in the landscape. They are, in many ways, natural antagonists to Pele, who is fire. And in the stories of Hayaka's journey, the Moo appear as obstacles, beings who have claimed certain watery places in the landscape and who must be confronted and defeated before the journey can continue. But the Moo are not simply villains. They, too, have their legitimate place in the landscape. They guard certain sacred ponds and pools. They are associated with the ancestral past, with the deep time before the current world. Their relationship with Pele and her family is complicated, sometimes hostile, sometimes negotiated, always charged with the elemental tension between fire and water that runs through the entire mythology. The landscape of the Big Island of Hawaii today is still marked by the stories. Travelers to Hawaii Volcanoes National Park walk through a landscape that the traditional Hawaiian worldview reads as the living domain of the goddess. Halemaumau Crater, where Pele's palace is said to be located, was one of the most frequently active volcanic features of the 20th and 21st centuries. Steam and volcanic gas still rise from its depths. The caldera walls are dark and dramatic against the sky. And on the black lava flows that cover much of the southeastern part of the island, the Hia trees are doing what they have always done, growing from the cracks in the cooling stone, extending their roots into the sparse volcanic soil, holding on and reaching for the sun. The tree that is Hia. The flower that is Lihua. Together on the new land, as they have always been. For the native Hawaiian practitioners who maintain the traditional spiritual relationship with Pele today, the volcano is not a relic of the past. She is a living presence. She is actively shaping the landscape of the island in ways that are measurable in inches gained each day as lava reaches the sea. She is a source of identity, of spiritual grounding, of connection to a lineage of people who have known this island for more than 1,000 years. In 2018, a major eruption in the Lower East Rift Zone of Kilauea destroyed more than 700 homes in the Leilani Estates subdivision and surrounding areas. It was one of the most devastating eruptions in modern Hawaiian history in terms of its impact on human communities. And the responses of the native Hawaiian community were notable. Many expressed grief, yes, and loss, yes, but also a recognition that Pele moves as she always has. That the land that had been built over by human structures was, in a profound and ancient sense, Pele's land. That the eruption was not a disaster imposed by an indifferent earth but an expression of a living presence that does not ask permission. This is a complicated perspective to hold in a modern world of disaster response and insurance claims and infrastructure rebuilding. But it is a genuine perspective, rooted in a cosmological understanding that is not less sophisticated for being ancient. It is a different relationship with the earth, one that has been developed over more than 1,000 years of living in intimate proximity to one of the most active volcanic systems on the planet. Part 11, Pele and the Natural World, What the Volcano Teaches. There is a kind of knowledge that only comes from sitting with something larger than yourself for a very long time. Not understanding it, exactly. Not mastering it or explaining it. But sitting with it. Paying attention to it across seasons and years. Learning its rhythms, its moods, its patterns. Developing a relationship with it that is built from countless small moments of observation and interaction and respect. The ancient Hawaiians had that relationship with the volcanic landscape. They lived on it, farmed its enriched soil, walked across its lava fields, sheltered in its caves, drank water that fell from its rainy peaks. They watched the volcano across generations, accumulating a body of observational knowledge that was encoded not in scientific papers but in stories. In chants. In the naming of things. In the ritual practices that structured the relationship between the people and the land. And what they learned, encoded in the mythology of Pele, is remarkably consistent with what modern volcanology has subsequently confirmed. Not in the specific details, the mythology is not a geological textbook, but in the broader truths about volcanic behavior and about the role of volcanic activity in the creation and sustenance of the Hawaiian Islands. Consider the geological reality that the Hawaiian island chain was formed by the movement of the Pacific Plate over a volcanic hotspot. This means that the volcanic activity has progressively moved from the northwest, where the oldest islands are most eroded, to the southeast, where the youngest and most active volcanoes are. In other words, the center of volcanic activity really did move down the chain in the direction that Pele travels in the mythology. The myth encodes the truth of the geology. Consider the role of volcanic activity in creating the extraordinarily rich soil of the Hawaiian Islands. The breakdown of volcanic rock over centuries creates some of the most fertile soil on Earth. The volcanic landscapes of Hawaii support extraordinary biodiversity, thousands of species of plants and animals found nowhere else on Earth. The islands that have been above sea level the longest and have had the most time for their volcanic rock to weather into soil are, in general, the most biodiverse. The fire, over time, creates the conditions for extraordinary life. Pele creates the land. Hayaka fills it with life. The fire makes the soil. The rain and the green things transform it. The truth that the mythology carries is the truth of the ecology, that destruction and creation are partners in the long work of the living earth. The mythology also encodes something important about the relationship between volcanic activity and human vulnerability. The people who lived on the slopes of Kilauea and Mauna Loa, the two most active volcanoes on the Big Island, were people who lived with a constant awareness of the possibility of eruption. This was not paranoia or superstition. It was practical reality. Lava flows have repeatedly, over centuries and millennia, moved through areas of human habitation on the island. The spiritual framework provided by the mythology of Pele did several important things in this context. It gave the volcanic activity meaning. It was not random, not senseless, not purely catastrophic. It was the movement of a being with agency and purpose. It was Pele going where she was going for reasons that, even if not fully comprehensible from a human perspective, were part of a larger order. This is psychologically and socially significant. Human beings can tolerate enormous difficulty when it has meaning. Randomness is far harder to bear. The mythology also established a protocol for living with the volcano, the kapu system, the offerings, the prayers, the consultations with the kahuna. These practices may not have physically altered the path of lava flows in most cases, but they provided structure, gave the community something to do in the face of an uncontrollable force, and maintained the relationship between the people and the land that was their home. And the mythology preserved a kind of ecological relationship with the landscape that is deeply practical. The kapu against taking certain plants near the caldera protected ecologically sensitive areas. The prohibition against removing lava rocks from the island, Pele's body, her bones, preserved the integrity of the volcanic landscape. The understanding of the Ha'alihua as sacred ensured that these crucial colonizer plants, the ones that begin the process of ecological recovery after an eruption, were respected and not casually harvested. There is a famous phenomenon in contemporary tourism at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park: visitors who take lava rocks from the park as souvenirs and then mail them back, sometimes years later, with letters describing the bad luck they have experienced since the removal. The park has a collection of these returned rocks, along with letters that range from funny to heartfelt to genuinely troubled. Whether the bad luck is real or imagined or a product of guilt, the pattern speaks to the persistent cultural memory of Pele's prohibition against disturbing her substance, her land, her bones, without her permission. What the people who work with the traditional Hawaiian spiritual practices would say is that the island is alive. That the rocks are not merely mineral objects to be collected. That the landscape has a mana, a spiritual power, that is not separate from the physical reality of the place but inherent within it. And that relationships with powerful, living presences require respect and appropriate behavior, not because of supernatural punishment but because of the nature of relationship itself. You do not take from someone you are in relationship with without acknowledgement. You do not enter someone's home without greeting. You do not use without offering something in return. These are the principles of relationship, applied to the relationship between people and the living landscape of the island. Pele's mythology is, among other things, a teaching about how to be in right relationship with the earth. In an era when the human relationship with the earth is under profound scrutiny, when the consequences of treating the natural world as a collection of resources to be extracted rather than a living system to be related to are becoming more difficult to ignore, this teaching has an urgency that extends well beyond the shores of Hawaii. What would it mean to relate to the land the way that the ancient Hawaiians related to Pele's domain? Not necessarily to adopt the specific practices of a tradition that belongs to a specific people in a specific place, that is not the invitation. But to carry the underlying principle, that the earth is alive. That what we take from it is a gift. That acknowledgement and gratitude and care are appropriate responses to that gift. That the fire and the water and the soil and the rain are not backdrop to human life but participants in it, with their own kinds of agency and their own kinds of need. The volcano does not need us to believe in it. It was there before us and will be there after us. Kilauea was erupting for thousands of years before the first human arrived on the Big Island and will continue erupting long after the last human departs. In this sense, Pele is perfectly self-sufficient. She does not require our devotion in order to exist. But we, perhaps, require her mythology in order to understand something essential about our own situation, our smallness in the face of geological time, our dependence on the living earth, our belonging to a world we did not make and cannot control but can, at our best, inhabit with grace. Part 12, The Eternal Fire, Pele's Legacy and Living Presence. We have traveled a long way tonight. From the ancestral homeland of Kahiki, across the open ocean, down the chain of islands from northwest to southeast. We have watched Pele probe the earth with her sacred digging stick, searching for the fire deep enough to hold her. We have seen her fight her sister of the sea, survive apparent defeat, and rise again in the deep caldera of Kilauea. We have watched her fall in love in a dream, send her most beloved sister on an impossible journey, burn with jealousy, and burn in rage. We have watched the green world return after the fire passed through. And now, at the end of this long night of storytelling, we arrive at the question that the story has been building toward from the very beginning. Not where does fire come from? We know that now. The question is, what does fire mean? Pele has been called, by those who study the tradition with depth and care, a goddess of transformation. Not merely of destruction, and not merely of creation, but of transformation, of the process by which one thing becomes another. The forest becomes ash, becomes new soil, becomes new forest. The ocean floor becomes mountain, becomes island, becomes homeland. The raw lava becomes rock, becomes cliff face, becomes sea arch, becomes tidal. Nothing is lost, exactly. Everything changes. This is the deepest teaching of the volcanic mythology. Change is not the enemy of continuity. Change is the mechanism of continuity. The island that exists today is not the same island that existed 1,000 years ago. It is larger, its coastline is different, its forests have grown and burned and grown again. It is continuously becoming what it will be next. And it is still Hawaii. Still the home of the people who have lived there. Still the domain of the goddess who made it. Pele is the living demonstration of this truth. She is ancient, older than human memory, older than the islands themselves, part of the deep geological story of the Pacific Ocean. And she is new, her most recent lava flows are some of the youngest rock on Earth, created within our own lifetimes, still cooling, still being shaped by wind and rain and the patient work of lichen and fern. Ancient and new simultaneously. Continuous and always changing. In the Hawaiian concept of time, this is not paradoxical. The past is not gone. It is present, layered beneath the surface of the present moment, informing and shaping and making possible everything that exists now. The genealogy is not merely a record of what has been. It is the structure of what is. The ancestors are not merely people who once lived. They are presences that continue to act in the world through the consequences of their actions and through the living descendants who carry their lineage. And Pele, who is the ancestor of the island itself, who made the ground that everything stands on, is present in every piece of basalt, every volcanic crater, every black sand beach, every sulfurous steam vent. Her past is not past. It is the ground beneath every living thing on the island. The tradition of Pele has survived an extraordinary series of historical disruptions. The arrival of Western ships in 1778, with Captain James Cook's appearance at the islands, changed everything about the Hawaiian world, brought new diseases that devastated the population, brought new religions that challenged the cosmological framework, brought new economic and political systems that eventually dismantled the traditional social order. The kapu system was formally abolished in 1819, even before Christian missionaries arrived in significant numbers. The heiau were torn down. The ritual practices that had structured Hawaiian life for 1,000 years were declared obsolete by the very chiefs who had most benefited from them. In this context, the survival of Pele's mythology is remarkable. It survived because it was not solely dependent on institutional structures, not on the heiau or the priestly hierarchy or the chiefly patronage. It survived because it was encoded in the landscape itself. You could demolish a temple, but you could not demolish Kilauea. You could forbid the practice of certain rituals, but you could not stop the volcano from erupting and reminding everyone who lived in its shadow that the fire was still there. That something was still alive in that mountain. That Pele had not left. The 19th century saw the recording of much of the tradition in written form, in the Hawaiian language newspapers that were published throughout that era, in the research of scholars like Martha Beckwith, in the collections of chants and stories made by Hawaiian cultural preservationists who recognized that the oral tradition was at risk. This recording was imperfect, done in a context of cultural disruption, translated through perspectives that were sometimes sympathetic and sometimes not, often fragmentary and inconsistent. But it preserved something crucial. It kept the stories accessible for the generations that followed. The Hawaiian cultural renaissance of the 20th century, the movement that revived the Hawaiian language, restored hula to its full complexity and seriousness, reclaimed traditional navigation and other practices, brought Pele's mythology back into active circulation in a new way. Not as a relic or a historical curiosity but as a living tradition, claimed and practiced by people who understood it as part of their identity and their relationship with the land. Today, Pele's mythology is part of a vibrant, contested, and deeply serious conversation about what it means to be Hawaiian, what it means to have a living relationship with a sacred landscape, and what responsibilities flow from that relationship. These conversations involve not only spiritual questions but legal and political ones, questions about who has the right to speak for the land, about how sacred sites should be protected, about the relationship between indigenous spiritual traditions and the scientific and governmental institutions that also make decisions about the volcanic landscape. The proposed construction of the 30-meter telescope on the summit of Mauna Kea, the tallest mountain on the Big Island, considered among the most sacred peaks in Hawaiian cosmology, sparked years of protest and legal challenge that involved exactly these questions. Native Hawaiian practitioners, astronomers, politicians, and cultural scholars engaged in a long and sometimes agonizing debate about how to honor both the scientific value of the summit site and the spiritual significance of the mountain to Native Hawaiians. At the center of that debate was the same fundamental question that Pele's mythology has always posed: what is this land, and how do we relate to it? Is it a resource to be used for human purposes? Or is it a being to be related to? Is the summit of Mauna Kea a particularly good location for astronomical instruments because of its elevation and clear sky? Or is it the dwelling place of divine presences that cannot simply be factored into a cost-benefit analysis? These are not questions with easy answers. They are exactly the kinds of questions that mythological thinking is designed to hold, not resolve, but hold. To keep open. To sit with. To allow to be complicated because the reality they point to is complicated. Pele does not simplify things. Fire does not simplify things. The volcano that is both creating and destroying, that is both ancient and perpetually new, that is both beautiful and dangerous, the volcano is not a simple thing. And the goddess who embodies it is not a simple goddess. She is the most complete expression of transformation in the Hawaiian tradition. And transformation, by its nature, is never entirely comfortable. To be transformed is to lose what you were in the process of becoming what you will be. The forest that burns does not enjoy the burning. The new land at the edge of the sea was not, moments ago, land at all, it was the bottom of the ocean. Everything that becomes something new passes through a moment of loss, a moment of dissolution, a moment where the old form is released and the new one has not yet solidified. Pele presides over those moments. She is the force that initiates them. And for a people who understood this about her, who had been watching the volcano transform the landscape for generations, her presence was both frightening and deeply reassuring. Because what she taught, by her very existence, was that transformation is not death. It is not annihilation. It is change. And the earth itself, which has been changing since before the sun was born, has never ceased to be the earth. The fire in the mountain is old beyond imagination. It has been burning, in one form or another, for millions of years. The specific volcanic system of Kilauea has been active for perhaps 500,000 years. The Hawaiian hotspot itself is tens of millions of years old. Long before there were humans, before there were birds, before there were any complex living things at all on these islands, the fire was there. Patient, deep, building from below. And she will be there still when the Big Island, carried by the Pacific Plate, has moved northwest past the hotspot and the volcanoes have gone quiet and the island has begun the long process of erosion that will eventually return it to the sea. 1,000,000 years from now, a new island will be forming to the southeast, the low ihic seamount, already growing from the ocean floor, driven by the same hotspot that built the Big Island. Pele will have moved there. Will be building something new. Will be doing what she has always done. The cycle continues. The fire continues. The island chain extends further. The old islands dissolve. The new ones rise. And the goddess of fire who lives inside the volcano goes on, ancient and present and permanent in her impermanence, building and burning and building again in the endless, patient, unstoppable work of making the world. She is there now, as you listen to this. Somewhere beneath the ocean floor of the Pacific, in a chamber of molten rock that has been hot since before the first human thought was thought, the fire is building. The pressure is rising. The new land is forming, inch by inch, year by year, in the darkness beneath the sea. Pele is dreaming. And in her dream, the next island is already taking shape. Closing meditation. Let the fire settle now into its deep places. Imagine, for a moment, that you are high above the island. Above the volcanic peaks and the green forests and the black coastline where the lava meets the sea. Above the steam and the sulfur and the slow, patient work of the earth. You are very high, and everything below you is quiet and still, moving in the slow way that the earth moves, too slowly for human eyes to see, but moving always, always building. The ocean is dark and vast around the island. The stars are reflected on its surface. And in the center of the island, deep in the caldera at the summit of the mountain, there is a soft red glow. Not dangerous. Not rushing toward anything. Simply glowing. Simply being. That is Pele in her deepest state. In the state beneath the stories, beneath the loves and the rages and the journeys across the water. In the state of pure being, ancient fire, patient and permanent, holding the center of the island in its warmth. You carry something like that inside yourself. A place that is deeper than the events of your day. Deeper than the worries and the plans and the memories that move through your waking mind. A warmth at the center of you that does not require anything from the outside world to sustain it. Rest there now. In that deep warmth. In that quiet glow. The island is still building, somewhere beyond your sleeping. The goddess is still dreaming in her palace of fire. The ocean is still shaping the new stone at the edge of the world. And you are here. Resting. Still. Held in the long and patient story of the world. Let your breath become slow and deep, like the breath of the mountain. Let your body become heavy, like warm rock settling into the earth. Let your mind become wide and dark and quiet, like the ocean at night, with only the softest light reflected on its surface. The stories will be here when you wake. The goddess will be in her mountain. The green things will be growing on the new land. For now, Simply rest. Simply rest. Good night. If you're still awake, just breathe slowly and let the ancient stories drift with you. Subscribe to Mythology for sleep for a new legend every week. Sweet dreams.